Well, we might get started. Hello and welcome. I am very pleased to welcome you to this joint Trobe Asia and 9-Line event, which is the launch of the third issue of Blue Security, which is titled Fair Winds and Following Seas, Maritime Security and Hedging in the South China Sea. My name is Bich Tran. I am the Director of Trobe Asia at La Trobe University in Melbourne, and I would like to start this event by acknowledging the elders of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. They are the traditional custodians of the land upon which La Trobe University Bundoora campus sits and the land upon which I am coming to you for this event. I would also like to pay respect to their people, both past and present, and extend that respect to any Indigenous Australians who might be joining us for this event today. So as I mentioned at the top, this is the third paper in our Blue Security Maritime Affairs series publication. And I'm really delighted to be hosting this launch with some friends and colleagues, experts in Southeast Asia who have collaborated on this third edition. So Hunter Marston, Bich Tran, Elina, Noor, and Richard Heydarian, welcome. And I just wanted to begin by giving a bit of an introduction for Blue Security, which is a collaboration between La Trobe Asia, Griffith Asia Institute, the University of New South Wales Canberra, University of Western Australia's Defence and Security Institute, the Asia-Pacific Development, Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue, and the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. I'm sorry, that is a very long list of collaborators, but we are all working on this series called Blue Security, and it's a program that engages with and facilitates high-quality research on issues of critical maritime security across the Indo-Pacific and is supported by Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So this edition brings together 4 experts who join me today for this panel, and I'm going to introduce them properly at this point. The lead author on this edition of Blue Security is Hunter Marston, who is an adjunct research fellow at La Trobe Asia, as well as a PhD candidate at the Australian National University and an associate with 9-Line. Welcome, Hunter. It's always great to have you along for these events.
Thanks, Beck.
We are also joined by Bich Tran, who is coming to us from Singapore. Bich is a postdoctoral fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew at the School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. Welcome, Bich. Again, also great to have you along for La Trobe Asia events.
Thanks, Beck. Glad to be here.
Also joined by Elina Noor, who is a senior fellow at the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Fantastic to have you here as well, and great that you were able to participate in this publication and the event.
Thank you for having me. It's good to see all of you on here.
It is nice to be on this event with all of us. And last but certainly not least, Richard Heydarian, who is a senior lecturer at the Asia Centre at the University of Philippines. Richard, it's been a while since I've seen you, so it's really great to have you on here, even if it is via Zoom. Welcome.
I know, it's pleasure. It's good to see everyone looking great. And yeah, I'm glad to see Hunter not very nervous about me coming in on time. Don't worry about it.
That's it. We've all made it on time. We're all here. We're all looking good. And we're all ready for a discussion about this third edition. And I will say that the issue is available in soft copy, so it's free. Kate can put a link in the chat function. You can go and access that. But if you would like a hard copy, please email us at La Trobe Asia and we can send you a hard copy of the publication as well. And it's a very interesting read. I mean, what I really love the most about this is that it's such a genuinely collaborative effort from experts who I know and respect and admire, who know Southeast Asia sort of in and out. And I think the value of the collaboration has really come through in the writing, but also in the very careful set of recommendations that you are offering to help deal with some of these really important maritime security issues and how states in Southeast Asia can manage things like great power contestation while dealing with the day-to-day issues of maritime governance and maritime security. So congratulations to the four of you. It's been wonderful working with you. And I might start the conversation. Before I do that, I will say we will have time for Q&A in the last 15 or 20 minutes, but I will begin the conversation by directing my first question to Hunter, who was the sort of the lead author, if you like, on bringing together this collaboration. And I'd like to begin with a kind of basic question, if you like, about the collaborative research that you undertook. I mean, what is it that you were interested in? What were you looking at? And why did you pick hedging as your framework for assessing maritime affairs in Southeast Asia?
Thanks very much, Beck. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I stand or sit in Ngunnawal and Ngambri country here in Canberra. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to Trobe Asia and 9-Line for their support for this event. And it's been an honor to work with all of my co-authors here, as well as the Blue Security Project or program in unison with Trobe Asia. This is a really all-star team, myself excluded perhaps. I'm really grateful to my co-authors for their willingness to come on board for this. It's been a really fun and rich learning experience for me, and hopefully our readers will gain a wealth of insights from their variety of perspective, as Beck mentioned. So a couple things. The lens of hedging and maritime security, I think, is a bit of a unique one. When we focus on Southeast Asia, so much of the discussion is on US-China competition and what's happening in South China Sea as tensions rise with maritime claimants and China's expanding claims. And my own PhD research focuses on hedging and the continuance of hedging policies in Southeast Asia amidst great power competition and amidst China's expanding territorial assertions in the South China Sea. And in particular, I think I've chosen to fuse these two in this case because much of the hedging literature sees this idea of hedging, contradictory signals, mixed policy signals, and ambiguous alignment as a risk mitigation strategy. But as we grapple with in this report, increasingly these hedging states are having to face direct threats to territorial integrity or even indirect threats and sort of forming a consensus around the evolving risk landscape as it verges on increasingly clear threats to Southeast Asian security. And that's not uniform across the region, which is one very interesting aspect of the case studies and the report, which we've tried to really get into rather than resist the variations across different countries. Secondly, as I've mentioned, the differentiation between risk and threat extends to how countries are assessing their threat landscapes. And I think in broad strokes, many Southeast Asian countries have stopped looking inwards and started to look outwards towards their maritime domains and to take on what some scholars have called an archipelagic consciousness. So as we look to the sort of top lists of threats facing Southeast Asian nations today, maritime security tends to be rather paramount. And that isn't limited to sort of China's gray zone coercion. As our report notes, there are also themes of climate change, illegal fishing, underreported fishing, and various other infrastructure erosion, threats to infrastructure and maritime domain. So I think that said, hedging offers one unique angle onto maritime security and lets us sort of assess these three countries in a comparative manner.
Thank you. That's a great sort of overview to start us off with. And Elina, if I can ask you, in your section, you mentioned that Malaysia's approach to the South China Sea has seen it to have a kind of aversion to strategic alignment and this insistence on not taking sides. I mean, this seems to be a kind of classic hedging approach. Could you elaborate on what this means in terms of its maritime policies, particularly as they relate to foreign policy? And is this a sort of model that other states in the region have also been choosing, or is it different from what other states are doing?
First of all, I think only Hunter could have brought us together, because when Hunter approached me with this project, I have to say I was a little averse, because anybody who knows me knows I'm averse to theory. And so I was really happy when Hunter clarified that, no, it doesn't have to be a theoretical framework. We're happy to look at case studies on a practical basis, and which I appreciated very much. And I also appreciate your question, Beck, because I think this is what we've seen in practice with Malaysia's foreign policy that has also been manifested in its approach to the South China Sea dispute. So I think maybe my phrasing of insistence on not taking sides in retrospect may have been a little glib, because I think what we see on a more nuanced basis is the fact that Malaysia has really been taking sides with particular powers, sometimes all at once or a few at a time, on different sets of issues. And what I mean by this, which I also provided as examples in my paper or my contribution to this publication under the Malaysia chapter, is at the height of South China Sea tensions in around 2013, 2014, if we can cast our minds back to 10 years ago, it all seems like so long ago. But around that time frame, when tensions were quite high all around, what you saw was actually an improvement and enhancement in Malaysia's bilateral relationship with China on multiple fronts, right? On political, economic, defense, and even people-to-people ties fronts. So on the political side, Malaysia and China completed a comprehensive strategic partnership. On the economic front, you had the Najib Razak administration seeking to leverage economic and investment opportunities with the expansion of China's Belt and Road Initiative. On the people-to-people ties, prior to the whole world being under lockdown, or most of the world, because of COVID-19, both the Najib Razak and Mahathir Mohamad governments granted visa waivers to Chinese tourists to tap into this growing travel market amongst Chinese citizens. And I think most significantly for our purposes is that on the defense front, between 2014 and 2018, the Malaysian Armed Forces held 4 bilateral exercises with their Chinese counterparts, which may seem counterintuitive, especially against the backdrop of these tensions in the South China Sea involving Malaysia and China, but also other claimant states in the area. And I think that this growing defense ties were actually seen to be quite substantial, given that Malaysia did not really have very many instances of defense cooperation with China. There was a long-standing agreement, an MOU that was signed way back in 2009, if I'm not mistaken, but nothing much ever came out of it. And so the fact that you had these exercises in the midst of what was going on in South China Sea was pretty remarkable. But all this against the larger backdrop of Malaysia's long-standing ties, again, on all fronts with the United States, with Australia, with European countries, and I can go into detail about the side or the nature of Malaysia's ties with the United States, but suffice to say right now that they've been very deep and wide and stretch back to the 1960s. So I think this very textured relationship that Malaysia has had with different powers, despite having had differences and some pretty serious ones, as with the South China Sea, shows that Malaysia has really been working hard in a way and not taking sides, but also taking sides on particular issues, if that makes sense.
Thank you. And we'll dig into some of those issues a bit later. But Bich, I wanted to turn to you now. Your section focuses on Vietnam's approach to maritime security in the region. And I know that you're preparing a book at the moment based on your PhD, which is about Vietnam's grand strategy more generally. So the question that I have for you, it sort of bounces off this idea of hedging and not wanting to take sides, but it's more about how does Vietnam juggle its interests in the South China Sea with other sets of foreign and defence policy interests, because it seems to me that sometimes, and maybe you might disagree, maybe the rest of the panel might disagree with this, but it seems to me sometimes that the South China Sea can become sort of everything in explaining a country's sort of foreign policy interests. But really, what role does the South China Sea play in the sort of suite of issues that Vietnam has to sort of deal with in its foreign and defence policies, including things like defence capabilities, including things like economic priorities and so on?
Thanks, Beck. It's good to be part of this wonderful project, and thanks for mentioning my book. Yes, so because the situation that you describe actually lead to Vietnam's ambivalence, the kind of mixed feelings to China, and this put Vietnam in a very difficult situation, because on the one hand, Vietnam has the motivation to have a like positive relationship with China for political and economic benefits. So if we go back to the end of the Cold War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and other the communist bloc, and Vietnam and China felt the need to consolidate the ties to ensure the regime survival in both countries. And after that, since 2004, China has been Vietnam's largest trading partner and the second largest export market. So it means that Vietnam not only relies on China for the supply of capital and intermediate goods for its manufacturing, but also the market for its agriculture products. So if there were a conflict in the South China Sea that would lead to the disruption in trade with China, it could greatly damage the Vietnamese economy. So because of these two reasons, Vietnam needs to maintain a cordial ties with China. But like you mentioned, the South China Sea dispute exists. So it's kind of create a cognitive dissonance in the Vietnamese leadership. So to address this cognitive dissonance, Vietnam tried to detach South China Sea disputes from the overall relationship with China and opt for hedging strategy. So by detaching, I mean, Vietnam agree with China to put the overall relationship as the most important things, and then try to address other disagreements, on the basis of what eases go first. So I'm referring to the 2011 agreement between the two countries about the 6 principles to address the sea-related issues. So come back to hedging. On the one hand, Vietnam tried to maintain diplomatic and economic engagement with China. So the two countries have, especially good party-to-party relations, which can help to ease tensions in the South China Sea if something happens. And then Vietnam, maintain a robust economic ties with China to for its own development purposes, despite existing disputes in the South China Sea. So, but on the other hand, it needs to improve its maritime capabilities to deal with China in the future in case of some conflict happens. So Vietnam is doing so by self-help efforts to modernize its militaries. buying a lot of weapons and equipments, mostly from Russia. But it also, since 2014, Vietnam has been more open to accept security assistance from its partners. So, including Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. So I mentioned, the details of this assistance in paper. So please feel free to read that. But then, at the same time, Vietnam also tried to internationalize the South China Sea disputes by bringing up the issue in multiple forums, especially ASEAN-centered forums like ASEAN Regional Forum and East Asia Summit. So in the paper, I kind of say that each element of the hedging strategy has its own benefits and drawbacks, but when combined, they can maximize Vietnam's advantages and minimize the risks in dealing with China. So that's that. Yeah, thanks. I will stop here.
Thank you so much. And Richard, if I can draw you in here, I'm not sure why in the introduction I went to call you Rachel, but it's definitely Richard. Totally don't know why that happened. But as you note in your section on the Philippines, their strategy, or its strategy in the South China Sea, has gone through some sort of quite interesting changes over the last couple of years. And I mean, certainly when I've looked at this in the past, it seems to me like leadership has played a big role in explaining the Philippines' sort of approach to the South China Sea, particularly in that crucial period after the 2016 arbitral tribunal ruling was released or was announced. So we kind of, there is that shift at the leadership level, but what's the public opinion like in the Philippines at the moment? Do they share this fluctuating approach to the South China Sea as well, or is it really happening at that kind of leadership level?
Thank you very much again, Beck. I thought I'm the only not morning person. Don't worry about it. Well, again, thank you so much to folks at La Trobe and all our partners for putting this together. Just like Lena and everyone else, I'm quite surprised at how things turned out, considering how difficult it is to corral an all-star Justice League kind of group, excluding myself, of course. So thank you so much also to Hunter for his tremendous amount of marathon-like patience for putting this together. And then, just to plug it in shamelessly, I'm doing a final revisions to the manuscript with Melbourne University Press, which looks at all of these countries we're mentioning here. So I'm gonna just, squeeze in all the citation from our fantastic paper here. So I'm very proud and happy to be here and to put you guys there. Now, speaking of the Philippines, I always hate this idea of exceptionalism, that we're quite different and all of that. But sometimes I have to admit there is something exceptional about the Philippines. I mean, we jokingly say we're the Latin Americans of Asia or the Latinos of Southeast Asia. And when you look at the Philippine foreign policy and how we're positioning ourselves on the South China Sea issue, we have to take into consideration at least two things, right? First, we're the only full-fledged U.S. treaty ally in the region. No offense to Thailand, but I don't think in any sense they were ever really a full-fledged ally. We can debate about whether their so-called alliance with the U.S. really is the same thing as what we have with the Americans, not to mention the colonial history and all of those things that Duterte has eloquently discussed over the past 6 years or so. But the other thing is we're also the only liberal democracy in the region. I mean, no offense to Indonesia and Malaysia, they have quite vibrant democracies, or the single-party rule democracy in Vietnam, but ours is really Latin American style of democracy. So that gives it a lot of unpredictability, inherent unpredictability. And in fact, every 6 years, we tend to vote in an anti-incumbency manner. The only exception was last year, but surprise, surprise, actually things are turning out very different from what many people are expecting from Marcos Jr. So you're absolutely right to say that it looks like in the case of the Philippines, the whims and the vision of leaders, political elite, the ruling elite, is extremely important in shaping the predisposition of the Philippines. And we saw that most dramatically, of course, First, in the case of President Arroyo, right, who tried to reach out to China when the Bush administration and our friends down under back then were bashing the Philippines for withdrawing coalition of the willing troops from Iraq in order to make sure someone is not decapitated by the precursor of Daesh or ISIS. And then later on, President Aquino also becomes the only leader in the region that takes China to international court. Then to top it all comes Duterte, who moves in a completely different direction and tries to shake up the system in a full-fledged, comprehensive, populist, demagogic sense. And sometimes his own personal whims and emotions were openly on display. So we have strong presidency system, especially when the presidents want to exercise the presidential prerogatives that they have. And now, of course, with Marcos Jr., on paper, he was supposed to continue what Duterte brought to the fore, but now he's also taking his own position. Now, I don't want to overstate, of course, the strategic agency of the Philippines. We are always interacting with the broader balance of power there. But this is where the second element, our alliance with the United States, comes in the picture. The reality is that alliance, at best, to put it mildly, has been suboptimal, perhaps for both sides. On the part of the Americans, perhaps the Philippines has been more of like their, kind of a tenant real estate relationship for them. We give them access, but beyond that, operationally, we haven't made much contribution to regional security as we should have. And in exchange, we feel that we have been taken granted by the Americans. And that brings me really to the question of public opinion. So if you look at the surveys in terms of favorability, of course, Americans come on top. No question about it. I mean, just the power of NBA and Hollywood and our ties. There are 5 million Filipinos in America. Most of our family members are based in the United States. So that element is there. But interestingly, this is what you don't see in many papers. But I constantly mention it in my papers. In 2017, just as Duterte comes in, there was a survey by Pulse Asia that showed that close to half of Filipinos, a large, very large plurality, short of 50%, were open to closer security cooperation with Russia and China, which is related to the other question, which was, the question was, what is the United States a reliable ally to us in the South China Sea or West Philippine Sea? Again, a large number were very much unsure about that. So America enjoys high favorability, but the reliability question was not there. And that's precisely what Duterte and pro-China elements, to put it honestly, have been exploiting over and over again throughout the years. So the challenge really was not only for the Philippines, but also for the US to deal with that reliability question. As it turns out, China has been even more unreliable than the United States, because instead of debt trap, now suddenly we're envious of Malaysia and Sri Lanka because we only got pledge trap. Only pledges, not much investments came in. And despite Duterte trying to compete with Hun Sen for gold medal in loyalty to China, we just got slapped around in the South China Sea during the Duterte era. Just at the same time, we saw the Trump administration and the Biden administration, and some of us played some role behind the scenes, actually also adopted a more reassuring position vis-a-vis the Philippines, particularly by verifying that the Mutual Defense Treaty applies to any attack on our troops, soldiers, aircrafts, and positions there in the South China Sea. So when all of these elements are coming together, it has made it much easier for President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. to do what is he doing today, which is a standard liberal reformist style of foreign policy. Marcos Jr., as I jokingly said, is 80% Aquino, 20% Duterte at best. So this is what's happening right now. But my hunch is, of course, Marcos Jr. will push for his own new synthesis when it comes to Philippine foreign policy, which remains to be seen, of course, for years to come. So I'll keep it there. Just read the paper and everything I've said online. Don't worry about it. I'm a vlogger. You can check my videos. Everything is there. So looking forward to more discussions.
Well, actually, I'm going to stick with you for the minute, if I may. I have to say, Pledge Trap sounds like a good name for a book. And it's great to hear that you've got a book coming out too. And if you need to come to Melbourne, any of you, if you have books to do book launches, please come and visit us. But sticking with you, Richard, because you mentioned Marcos Jr.'s sort of approach. But in the last 12 months or so, the Biden administration has sought to enhance, relations across the region. We've seen Marcos Jr. and Biden meet and talk about things like economic relations. There does seem to be a growing awareness that any kind of Indo-Pacific strategy from the US needs to have a much greater economic dimension. But just wondering, how do you see this fitting in with the Philippines' hedging strategies, broader maritime security issues, and are we seeing, you know, a real lurch towards Washington from Manila?
Yeah, thank you for that fantastic question. I mean, I'm part of a separate project on the Indo-Pacific economic framework when, you know, we're looking at how the United States is dealing with the region. And you know, for all my creativity, the Philippine chapter was quite difficult for me. So I had to be creative around it, precisely because if you look at the Philippine-US alliance, despite the deep history and everything that came with the Philippine-American Commonwealth and the free trade agreements we had, today, Vietnam, a communist nation, a former American enemy, their trade surplus with the United States is more than 10 times our total exports to United States. It's a crazy situation. And that's why President Marcos Jr. early on said, we want trade, not aid. Obviously, you know, the blame can go in many directions, including the oligarchic economic structure in the Philippines, whereby the oligarchs in the Philippines are invested in a protectionist system. Although some of the more oligarchs, I mean, really crony capitalism started in the Philippines first before in Kremlin, right? If you look at the literature, political science literature. So this is a serious problem we have had. Nevertheless, I have been one of people who are vocally saying, I hope the Philippines doesn't turn out as Fortress Asia or New Pearl Harbor. I don't like this situation whereby everyone is excited, including our Australian friends and Japanese, to sign new defense agreement, to come visit for defense issues. But to be honest, despite this announcement that there will be a special trade mission by Biden to Philippines and all, I'm not sure much is happening. So I just came from Taiwan and was talking to our Taiwanese friends about why not the Philippines could be part of a Taiwan +1 semiconductor production kind of strategy. I come from a city in the Philippines built by Americans where Texas Instrument has been active there for more than half a century. We have a lot of experience in semiconductor production, etc. But for some reason, there's just not really much new large-scale investments coming in. So we enviously look at Biden, not only Biden going to Hanoi and skipping Philippines and Jakarta along the way, but top executives from tech companies, semiconductor companies in the US going to Vietnam, not to the Philippines, etc. This is a sticking point. And we're just luckily for US, China has not been offering much, right? But had China been smarter about its approach to the Philippines, had they come forward and did major investments, I think the field would have been far, far more competitive. Except so the US is winning the game kind of now, but this is by default. But more and more voices, including yours truly, have been saying the economic dimension of our relationship with America is extremely, extremely underdeveloped. And our bilateral free trade negotiations with America have really not been going anywhere. The only thing I hear from our American counterparts is that, you know, before you were in the, you know, back of the line, you're kind of now in the middle of the line. I mean, it's like that. But we know there's market access is just not going to happen with a new bipartisan protectionism in America. So there's a lot of scratching of the head happening here. So long term, again, I'm not sure. There could be another plot twist in Philippine-US relations if China makes a big moves and the US doesn't double down on the momentum that it has already generated with the Philippines. So in short, no room for strategic complacency. Philippines is still up for grabs, even if it's a US ally, precisely because it's at the front line of the US-China competition. We are closer to Taiwan than practically, I mean, Manila is closer to Taipei than practically all ASEAN major capitals. That tells you how important the Philippines is, even on the Taiwan question. But that's also where China will have to make a move, and they may make a move. So this is why I appreciate the question. It's still a very lopsided bilateral relationship with Americans. And same goes for Australia, I would say, but not for Japan. I think Japan has a very comprehensive relationship with the Philippines, which the US can learn from.
Yeah, and I would love to get back to Japan and the United States a little bit later in the discussion. But I guess one of the things about if leadership is such an important aspect for explaining policy within a context of these big strategic games, it does mean that there are, you know, that it can be a little bit less predictable. But Vietnam offers a different model in terms of political system. So Bich, I'd like to ask you about Vietnam. It is not a liberal democracy, like unlike the Philippines, but it also seems to be moving closer to Washington as well. US-Vietnam relations have just recently been upgraded to a comprehensive strategic partnership. Some of these terms I'm a bit iffy about, you know, strategic partnership, comprehensive strategic partnership, and it does get to the point that, Richard, I think you were making about, well, signing stuff is great, but what does this actually mean? So Bich, do you see this as really fitting in with the idea that Vietnam and the United States are getting closer? And how does this fit with this broader hedging framework?
Yeah, thanks, Beck. So, if we look in just, focus on the hedging framework like in the paper, then I think that a closer relationship with the United States will further enhance Vietnam maritime capabilities, and later, to some extent, will reduce economic dependence on China. But then, if we look into a broader picture, like you mentioned my book on Vietnam grand strategies, then actually the comprehensive strategic partnerships with the United States actually fit into Vietnam's grand strategy very well and its ambition. So Vietnam wants to, elevate its status in international affairs. So by having all 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council to be, its strategic partners, Vietnam has proven its significance in the global affairs. And like Richard mentioned that the United States offered to turn Vietnam into a semiconductor hub. So this further elevate its standings.
Thank you. And Elina, I'll bring you in here. I mean, Malaysia is different again on the US and different again on how it seems to spotlight the South China Sea or has sort of responded to some of these tensions. But more broadly, I'd like to get your views on the Biden administration's focus on Southeast Asia. It seems that there is this sort of push for more engagement, but it's a bit patchy at times, particularly in the turning up dimension. There's been some issues around not necessarily coming to all of the big discussions and dialogues. But is this really about China? Is this what is driving the US? Or is there a genuine interest from your view, from the US in wanting to engage with Southeast Asian countries?
With the Biden administration, I think it's been a little of both. Now, what that mix is and what that percentage of either, I think depends on which capital in Southeast Asia you sit in and at what period, right? So Richard talked about the Philippines moving up this line. I feel that sitting here in Washington, there is a bit of a hierarchy of sorts in terms of Washington's approach to Southeast Asia. And I only half jokingly say that this tiered hierarchical approach to Washington's policy towards Southeast Asia right now seems to be, so at the very top, you have countries like Singapore, Vietnam, and sometimes the Philippines, right? The Philippines kind of floats, I think, depending on what the issue is. If it's the South China Sea, then it's definitely top 3. And so that choice, particularly with Vietnam and the Philippines, I think highlights the focus on China if you're looking at it from the lens of, Washington. But somewhere kind of in the middle tier, you have countries like Indonesia, like Malaysia, kind of somewhere at the bottom of that second tier. And then Thailand, I think there was a bit of a hope for a while, maybe a day or two, and then that quickly fell back down with how the elections have turned out. But maybe we'll see under this new Thai government, relations could be improved again, still to be seen. And then kind of at the bottom tier, unfortunately, I feel are the CLM countries, right? And so this tiered approach, I think, is largely dependent on China and how big the China threat is at a particular time from Washington's standpoint. But to be fair, I think the Biden administration has been hearing a lot of the voices from Southeast Asia that it should be paying attention more to Southeast Asia for Southeast Asia's sake. And speaking of plot twists, right, Richard mentioned plot twists. We're still to see what this focus will be when silly season kicks into high gear next year with the US presidential election on the horizon. So stay tuned is all I can say for now.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. US politics might throw in a plot twist. I mean, there's plenty of drama when it comes to the South China Sea. I never thought I'd be getting requests to comment on Barbie, but you know, that's happened this year as well. So that's a plot twist there. But Hunter, coming back to you, I mean, I'm going to ask you about Japan and Australia, but before I do that, I'm going to ask you a very difficult conceptual question, and that is, you know, scholars in international relations, particularly I think of the more realist persuasion, have been, I think, skeptical of hedging as a framework because there's a kind of belief that hedging will only get you so far, or that the strategic conditions or structural conditions will ultimately force states to make choices. So I wanted to get your sense from, you know, the research that's been conducted here. I know that it's focused on maritime and South China Sea, but how do you see this as sort of feeding into some of these broader questions around international relations, around what these tipping points are? At what point can these countries that we've sort of talked about, three in particular in Southeast Asia, that are broadly hedging but are actually taking, you know, different approaches if you look at the nuance of it, can these countries continue to hedge or to leverage strategic competition, or is there a point at which choices will be imposed, and is that likely to do with conflict in the region, or will there be other things that will ultimately sort of compel smaller and middle power states to make choices?
Yeah, it's a good question, and rather provocative one. I think there are a couple different ways to answer it, right? There's the sort of academic literature on this, which is mostly trying to make predictions about the limits of hedging, and I think has failed to provide a convincing answer, because the majority of academics say, you know, hedging is only possible under certain conditions, and agrees that bipolarity or great power rivalry tends to erode the feasibility of hedging and force states to choose sides. I think it's possible to examine that playing out currently, and part of what my PhD project is trying to do is push back on the prevailing consensus in the literature and say, actually, we can test this in real time today. I would argue in certain countries like Vietnam and the Philippines, those threat perceptions toward China have shifted dramatically in the last decade. While there's still no consensus in Vietnam, you know, for instance, during my fieldwork interviews in Hanoi, I received a wide variety of perspectives from those within government and those adjacent to government about what China means for Vietnam. Is it a critical partner? Is it a security threat? Is it a bit of both? Is it more of an abstract risk and a distant threat? And I think some of that lack of consensus is what propels hedging, because there's not a clear sense of, here's what we need to do as international relations realists would predict. Set up a strong balancing counterposture, which arguably the Marcos administration is beginning to do in the Philippines today. I think it remains to be seen, as Richard points out, and has pointed out before, 6 years is a long time for a presidential administration. And when you look at past Philippine administrations, there's plenty of change from beginning of an administration to the end, when presidents are forced to make a variety of changes to their policies, and really, you know, what China does or what the United States is willing or not willing to do as an ally will have a great determining influence on the evolution of Philippine foreign policy over those 6 years. So I'm not holding my breath when it comes to Marcos' foreign policy. I think there's plenty of time yet for that to evolve. But my sense is that relative consensus now around the threat that China poses to Philippines' maritime territorial sovereignty in the West Philippine Sea is significant enough to have led to more clear elements of balancing and less hedging behavior. Of course, Manila still wants to retain China as an important economic partner and have a working positive relationship with this pivotal giant in the region. So that preserves some elements of hedging. And it might be that in 4 years, we look back and say, actually, the Marcos administration showed more continuity with Duterte than we would have imagined or currently imagine. So that's sort of the theoretical and the practical response to that question. The flip side to this, of course, is, are there countries that have stopped hedging? You know, the Philippines I just touched on as a potential example. Another paper I published earlier this year with a journal in Singapore, Contemporary Southeast Asia, argues that in internal domestic politics and regime security, personal interests to safeguard regime interests in Cambodia and Myanmar have led to bandwagoning policies with China. So these countries, when they don't face an external threat to their security, but there are internal threats to regime security, they could decide to bandwagon with China for purposes of either regime strength or personal profit. Economic profit, which is, I think, the case in both Cambodia and Myanmar currently. It's a bit of a messy case study, and I'm happy to go into further details, but I don't think that's applicable here today.
Yeah, and I wonder, like, to the extent that the bandwagoning states are those that don't have maritime and territorial disputes in the South China Sea. They are more sort of continental or land-based Southeast Asian states rather than the maritime states, which makes looking at the maritime element in relation to hedging, I think, really quite interesting as well. But Hunter, I mean, I wanted to get back to the idea of you know, putting some substance behind some of these, you know, signing papers and things as we talked about before. And how can extra-regional states like Australia, and we mentioned Japan before, Japan is probably a really good role model in some of the economic and investment engagement, and also in maritime security through things like Coast Guard training in Southeast Asia. But how can these states support the maritime strategies of Southeast Asia? And just as a slight follow-on, I mean, one of my concerns sometimes sitting in Australia is that there is a bit of a wishful thinking about how far Southeast Asian states are actually moving towards closer relationships with the United States, and also further, you know, or more distant relationships with Beijing. So I'm wondering whether you can sort of comment on that.
Yeah, perhaps, you know, I'll address the second question first. I agree with you completely. And I think that thinking is prevalent in Washington as well, where I have spent some years. I think, you know, in terms of Vietnam's decision to upgrade its relationship or partnership with Washington to a comprehensive strategic one, I think, you know, it's important to keep in context Vietnam's multilateralization and diversification strategy, which Bich has written quite a bit about and has been consistently voiced over the years. So it's not just about moving towards Washington and away from Beijing. Of course, it's sort of moving incrementally and simultaneously to deepen relationships with both countries. And even a country like Singapore, which Washington looks to as its sort of preeminent partner on the level of an ally in Southeast Asia, is very careful to remain neutral and preserve an even keel in its partnerships with competing superpowers. So to your question about what extra-regional partners can do, we have a list of recommendations. I won't list all of those or read them all out here. I'll just focus on a few. We highlight the role of public diplomacy, and in particular, things like how the United States, I'm sort of speaking for myself and not all of our authors here. I should be careful as well, because the recommendations actually don't reflect a consensus and are sort of piecemeal, which again reflects the diversity of views across the region. So I'll just speak to a few of those. One is public diplomacy. You mentioned in recent years how the United States has taken a more vocal position to speak out against China's infringements in, say, the West Philippine Sea, its behavior around Mischief Reef of late. And I think that does provide some succor or some confidence to Southeast Asian partners and allies when the United States is seen to take a stance on the behavior, not necessarily the sovereign claims in the South China Sea and the maritime territorial disputes themselves. But just speaking out to shine a light on these issues goes a long way. You know, the New York Times recently did this interesting story of what it looks like when a Chinese PLA vessel or maritime militia comes and shines a spotlight on a Philippine Coast Guard vessel or fishing vessel. And I think just providing images to lend stories to what's taking place out there in these distant seas for people in some of these countries, even in the Philippines, you know, an archipelagic island country, not everybody thinks, you know, about events in the South China Sea. So shining a light on these issues does go a long way towards raising awareness and countering China's own messaging on this issue that extra-regional states like the United States should stay out of this, stay out of these disputes. Something else we touch on is this idea of full spectrum capacity building and working with Southeast Asian partners to shore up maritime infrastructure development. There's already room for this to grow based on a 2022 trilateral agreement between the United States, Japan, and Australia to work on infrastructure development in the region. And we argue that some of this should be now addressing climate change and specifically focused on maritime port infrastructure. Another is sharing maritime domain awareness. Again, a lot of this already goes on. One recent example is the US P-8 Poseidon aircraft that were overhead in the Mischief Reef dispute last month, which were monitoring China's standoff with Philippine Coast Guard vessels and fishing vessels to lend support to an ally, but also just to signal that these are international waters and not China's waters, and that, you know, this sort of behavior will not fly, and, you know, that it's visible to the international community. Bich touches on the idea of quantum sensing, which is sort of a new area we can go into and do go into further in the recommendations. And then finally, we talk about how Quad countries can work with ASEAN to form working groups around climate change and maritime security, as well as support the next generation of voices and emerging leaders along the lines of the Waisili initiative to promote discussions around and expertise on maritime security in particular.
Thank you. I'm really glad to see that we have a few questions in the Q&A. So we have about 10 minutes to go. So what I'll do is I'm going to pose these three questions that I have in front of me to the panel, and then I'll go around and I'll ask all of our panelists, starting with Richard and moving backwards, what their thoughts are on one, or if you want to pick up all of the questions, you can do that as well. So the first question is about the inaugural ASEAN Solidarity Exercise, ASEX 2023, around the Batam and Natuna Islands. How does ASEAN solidarity in South China Sea play into the hedging strategies of the case study states? And actually, I might add a little bit about that, because, you know, part of what we see here with individual states' approaches to the South China Sea is what that means for ASEAN as an institution. If anyone wants to comment on, you know, solidarity in ASEAN as a question. The second question is, what possible motivations, if any, might non-claimant states in ASEAN like Thailand and Cambodia have to offer for offering more support to other ASEAN states, claimant states, in relation to the South China Sea? That's a really good question. And the third is directed mainly towards Bich and Hunter. There are reports that Vietnam is considering purchasing F-16s from the United States, which sounds like an unprecedented move if that were to come true. And so the question is, to what degree would that alter the balance of power in the South China Sea, and also hint towards an evolution in Vietnam's ground strategy, hedging strategy, and also how realistic is this procurement plan? Noting that there are also potential plans for Vietnam to continue arms purchasing with Russia. So what are the sorts of risks and opportunities that come with a kind of diversification in defence procurement? So Richard, I might start with you, and then I'll go to Bich and Elina, and then to Hunter.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Bich. Just quickly also on the point that you raised with Hunter on the issue of when do you say that hedging has stopped and alignment has started? To be honest, we are already verging into the matters of military affairs, you know, technicalities. So for me, it's hard to say if the Philippines is aligning unless we have more even intelligence, right? what kind of weapon systems are Americans going to be allowed to put in some of the bases under Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, how close to Taiwan. So suddenly you go into the operational issues. And I think because of this alignment hedging issue, I've been forced to a little bit brush up on my military affairs analysis. And I think this is where things get very, very interesting, because the line is almost pink, right? It's not a very clear line. Now, going back to the questions here, I mean, of course, earlier this month, I was in ASEAN for summit and related affairs, etc. So I talked to people, you know, from Jakarta, people who are advising Jokowi, etc. So I ended up essentially writing multiple articles contradicting myself, right? Speaking in different voices. On one hand, I understand where Jokowi is coming from, right? Because Jokowi's idea is that let's focus on the low-hanging fruits and the areas where we agree most so that we can make the most out of this time in my legacy months, right? These are twilight months. And the idea of coming up with a kind of a solidarity all ASEAN exercises should be understood within that context, right? We have to show some sort of force, collective force, right? The problem, though, of course, is that on the South China Sea issue, the differences seem to be very large among member states. I mean, Cambodia even was iffy about the location or even the exercises to begin with because, it might hurt their best friends. And then Marcos Jr. coming in, guns blazing, and saying, we have to do something dramatic on the South China Sea issue and all. In the end, look at it. Who attended it? The Philippines was not there. Cambodia was not there, despite that, which brings me to the second issue. The location was changed. It was first supposed to be in North Natuna Sea, and then they brought it down. And third, the nature of exercises, there was no live fire exercises. So on multiple levels, I can bash it and say so much for solidarity. But at the same time, you know, doing this ASEAN thing for quite some time, I would say, well, it's a good start, better than nothing. But I hope there'll be a follow-through on that. Realistically, and this bleeds to the second question, is the most I am expecting from our friends who have no disputes with China in the South China Sea, etc., is just don't be spoilers, right? As long as some of them are just not spoilers, including one who was a spoiler on the North Natuna Sea exercises and didn't attend at all, just don't spoil things. Which brings me to my issue. Honestly, the only way ASEAN can work is minilateralism on the South China Sea issue, because the ASEAN 10 is based on unanimity, not consensus. Anyone who understands basic Arabic knows that Muafakat is more EU-like consensus, but so far under weaker leaders in ASEAN, it's more really unanimity-based. So good luck with getting any kind of unanimity. Multiple countries are not on board on dealing with South China Sea at all. So let's do what Indonesia even offered a few years ago. You know, Bakamla said that, why not just claimant states together with Singapore, Malaysia, let's do just more exercises and solidarity and all. So for me, that is really the only reasonable way forward. I'm trying to be as fair as possible. So for me, if you adjust your expectations, we can get something out of this, including expectations that you're not going to get really much out of this at the level of ASEAN 10. I mean, the statement that came out of ASEAN earlier this month, look at it, it's like how many, 36, 7 pages, whatever. It's only towards the end you see Myanmar and South China Sea, and it ended up even more tepid than we expected. But I think they tried to compensate it with this pseudo solidarity exercise. So for me, adjust expectations, focus on multilateralism. And sorry, I mean, one reason why perhaps I'm not in Singapore is because, don't force it. It's not going to work, ASEAN 10. And minilateralism might actually make ASEAN look more relevant rather than undermine ASEAN. So I totally do not buy this argument that, minilateralism really divides us. Well, we're already divided. There's no ASEAN stance really as a 10 on the South China Sea issue. So be realistic, work with what you got, and perhaps we can make more impact if we work it minilaterally among ourselves.
Sounds like you've got a minilateral pragmatism going on there, Richard. But Bich, I might turn to you for some of your responses.
Yeah, so for the interest of time, I only meant, we'll talk only about the question of Vietnam's modernization. So you and Hunter mentioned the key word there, diversification. So it's one of the 5 principles of Vietnam's grand strategy. And here I would like to take the opportunity to clarify that Vietnam's grand strategy is different from its hedging strategy, because hedging is concerned how to mitigate the risks. So you have like many risks, for example. So this risks concern the South China Sea, but for example, if Vietnam wants to avoid risks in the Mekong Delta, for example, it will, have like different components in the hedging strategy or in the Mekong. But on grand strategy, diversification is one of the 5 key principles. So it's actually easier for Vietnam to do that in, like diplomatic and economic domains. But it's really difficult for Vietnam to do that in the military domain because, the first issue is the compatibilities. The majority of Vietnam's weapons and military equipment came from Russia. So how to incorporate new systems in the existing ones will be the main challenge. And then the second issue is the budget. So I think, the United States is keen for Vietnam to reduce its dependence on Russian arms and maybe trying to come up with some creative idea on helping Vietnam to acquire US system. But we will have to wait to see. Thanks.
Thank you. Elina, any final thoughts from you?
I think I'm going to take a slightly different perspective from Richard and defend multilateralism within the ASEAN context. Look, I think it depends what your expectations are. And in this case, I agree with Richard, right? If your expectation of the ASEAN solidarity exercise was for this grand show of solidarity against what is going on in the South China Sea, then of course you're going to be disappointed because that's not what it was intended to do. If you look at the participation, even East Timor was involved, and this is really it's a solidarity exercise. Whether or not it succeeded in its theme is still up in the air, but it is a start to building a habit of cooperation, operational cooperation and coordination, which hasn't always been the case in Southeast Asia. You have a habit of cooperation among the maritime countries, but not so much with the mainland countries. And I think this is one way of incentivizing countries like Thailand and Cambodia to maybe have a little bit of an interest in what's going on in the South China Sea, because if something goes on in the Mekong, for example, we might have to rely on this habit of cooperation in a completely different domain and apply it to a situation that only concerns a certain number of countries in Southeast Asia. So I'll just stop here in the interest of time.
Thank you. That's why it's so good to bring you all together to have, slightly different perspectives on these issues. And Hunter, the last word is with you. And I'm very sorry to the people who have put fascinating questions into the chat. We won't get time to answer those today, but you can perhaps email them to Trobe Asia, and we might invite our authors to get back to you with responses. But Hunter, final words from you?
Thanks, Beck. I'll try to do a little scattershot and keep it short. I note Christian Wells's excellent question in the Q&A about incentives for countries like Thailand and Cambodia that are non-South China Sea claimants to take a more active stance on the South China Sea. And to be cynical, I see no incentive for them to do so, as demonstrated by Cambodia's 2012 chairmanship of ASEAN and the failure to pass a joint communique. It's a lesson it learned and certainly an example it doesn't want to repeat, but I think it's emblematic of Cambodia's willingness to just look the other way on these issues. And sadly, I think Thailand also has no incentives to stick its neck out. I want to touch on something Bich already addressed, but Florian's question about the potential for Vietnam to purchase American F-16s. I think there are two ways to read this. It could be quite literal, that Vietnam is looking to diversify away from Russian arms. As Bich notes, Vietnam is quite dependent on Russian exports. It's the 5th largest buyer of Russian weapons and imported more than $7 billion from 1995 to 2021, 2/3 of total arms exports. So it could be that it wants to diversify away from this, as sanctions on Russia have complicated Vietnam's procurement strategy. It could also be a very good bargaining tactic in trying to avoid US sanctions as part of the CAATSA legislation, which has been threatened before. And finally, it could just be that Vietnam sort of wants to do both and is going to continue acquiring Russian weapons anyways. US military equipment is not going to be compatible with Russian equipment. There's a reason I think Vietnam has doubled down on its defense partnership with India, because so much of India's military equipment and military personnel are familiar with Russian equipment. So that provides a natural sort of synthesis of working relationships. And I see a number of other questions. I'm sorry we couldn't address some of these. They're all quite good. So I'm very thankful to everyone who's engaged in the Q&A and the audience for listening. And thanks again to the co-authors. Thank you, Beck and Troy and Kate, for your stewardship of this publication, and hope everyone will get a chance to read it, available online.
Thank you so much. You've done a nice wrap up there for the event as well, Hunter. And I'm sorry we've taken us a little bit over time, but I'm sure that those audience members who are with us would agree that it was an absolutely fascinating conversation. I hope that in the future we might be able to finish this have this conversation in person in the region at some point. But please, thank you. Join me in thanking our panelists. It's been a wonderful discussion. And as Hunter mentioned, it's available in soft copy, which you can access, but the publication is also available in hard copy, and we are happy to send that out to anybody who is interested. Yes, it's been a wonderful conversation. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to thank 9-Line as well for collaborating on this event. So thanks again to our authors, and wishing you all an excellent afternoon or morning or night or wherever you happen to be in the world. But thanks again.
Thanks, Beck. Fantastic.